Hello everybody, and welcome to part 14 of the Star Wars Legends Chronological Review series. Today we are coming back to the Tales of the Jedi comics with this arc titled simply Tales of the Jedi, or alternatively, The Beast Wars of Onderon. So this is actually the first Tales of the Jedi arc published, even though it comes after the two arcs that we've already reviewed, and they tell a story of a Jedi named Ulic Qel-Droma, who looks like he's going to be pretty important for the Star Wars story for the next little while, so let's go ahead and jump straight into it. Our story today begins 1,000 years after the end of the Great Hyperspace War, and though the Republic has existed for a long time, new planets are constantly being explored and settled every day as the Republic expands its borders. On one such planet named Arcania, a Jedi compound is held where we meet a Jedi student named Ulic Qel-Droma, who is presently dueling a training droid. Though he is very skilled, Ulic's master Arca warns Ulic not to be too overconfident in his training, as overconfidence has been many a great Jedi's downfall. Master Arca wants his student to focus on the Force and is worried that Ulic's arrogance may get the best of him. After the lesson, Master Jeth tells Ulic, his brother Kay, and the other students a story about the planet of Onderon, a planet that was recently discovered by the Republic. Civilization on Onderon had over the millennia developed within an enormous walled city called Isis, the purpose of which was to keep themselves safe from the creatures that came from the nearby moon of Zune. The city would dump their criminals outside its walls to be killed by the hostile native creatures, but eventually these exiles learned to survive and tame the creatures, leading to centuries-long conflicts with the city folk known as the Beast Wars. Master Arca finishes his story by telling his students that the Jedi have given him Onderon to look after with the intention of ending their war, but he has decided to send them, his 3 students, instead as a test of their knighthood. So, Ulic and Kay Qel-Droma and their Twi'lek friend, Taut Donita, board their ship, the Nebulon Ranger, and head for Onderon. Though they are attacked by beast riders on the way in, the Jedi land safely at the city and have an audience with Onderon's queen, Aminoa, who is unnaturally old and can feel the Force. Though they were sent to Onderon to restore peace, they are soon forced by the queen to help defend the city against a full-on assault from the beast riders and their deadly warrior commandos. Despite the valiant efforts of the Jedi, during the battle, the commandos are able to slip into the royal quarters and capture the queen's daughter, Gallia. Vowing to prove himself as a Jedi, Ulic Qel-Droma rallies his friends to board the Nebulon Ranger and fly into the wilds of Onderon to rescue the princess. Moving on to issue 2, the Jedi's ship is struck down by a seeker torpedo and they crash land in the wilderness. Upon emerging from the ship, the 3 Jedi are confronted by beasts named Bomas. However, Taut Donita uses his rare Force ability of being able to speak to animals, and they are able to use the tamed Bomas as mounts. The Jedi storm the castle of Modon Kira, the Lord of the Beast Riders, and find out that the princess is about to marry the Lord's son, Oron Kira. Instead of responding with violence, Modon invites the Jedi to have a peaceful dinner, where they discover that Gallia genuinely loves Oron, and they staged a fake abduction so that she could live with him and the Beast Riders. Gallia also stuns Ulic with a revelation. The city of Isis is under the power of the dark side of the Force. Oron recites a story of a Jedi-turned-Sith named Frida Nad, who has influenced the city of Isis in secret for over 400 years. The Beast Riders discuss making a final attack against the city to end the rule of the dark side and challenge the Jedi to join them, but Ulic tries to convince everyone to seek a more peaceful solution just as he promised his master. The Jedi return to the city with Gallia and Oron to discuss peace with the Queen, but this only makes the Queen furious and she invokes the spirit of Frida Nad to fill her with dark side power. With Ulic's mission of peace having failed, he agrees to fight alongside the Beast Riders for the fate of the planet. Everybody escapes the Queen's throne room except for Ulic's brother Kay, who is left to face the Queen and her forces alone, and his arm gets cut off in the battle. Outside the city, knowing that the Jedi have failed, the Beast Riders begin the battle. However, the Queen is able to weaken the Beast Rider forces and confuse their beasts with the power of dark side battle meditation. The tide of the battle turns in the city's favor. Ulic rescues his brother just as a mysterious ship enters Onderon's sky, and suddenly the battle turns in the favor of the Beast Riders, and the great city of Isis falls. The ship turns out to be flown by Master Arca, who used his own battle meditation to invigorate the Beast Rider troops. Arca is not happy to see his students, saying that they should have been able to anticipate the dark side as soon as they arrived, and that they failed his test by allowing the war on Onderon to get even worse. Arca leads his students and Gallia to the tomb of Frida Nad, where Arca is able to flush out the dark side with his light. However, as a result, the Queen dies. With the influence of Freda Nad now gone, Gallia unites Onderon by marrying Oron under the laws of the Republic, and Kay is tasked with staying on the planet for a while to make sure things stay peaceful. Ulic asks how a Jedi like Freda Nad could succumb to the dark side, and Arca simply replies that though it doesn't happen often, it has happened more than once, and he prays that it does not happen to Ulic. Starting issue 3, we switch to a new setting and a new set of characters. We meet a Jedi named Nomi Sunrider, as well as his wife Nomi and their infant daughter Vima. The family and their droid, 3D, travel to a spaceport on their way to the Stennis system to meet the legendary Jedi Master Thrawn. At the station, some gangsters overhear Ander talking about his rare Adegan crystals that he's carrying, and decide to ambush him and steal the crystals. The gangsters are actually able to sneak up on Ander and kill him with a bite from a poisonous creature. After he dies, his spirit appears to his grieving wife, assuring her that she too is strong with the Force like him, and she picks up his lightsaber to defend herself against the gangsters. Although she is shaken by the death of her husband, Nomi decides to finish his mission and uses the Force to find her way to Master Thrawn. She lands on a strange planet and sets out on foot with the Force as her guide, eventually finding the home of a Jedi named Osweiler and his creature friend. However, the same gangsters that killed her husband are able to track Nomi down and attack the Jedi's home. The creature comes to the rescue, defeating the enemies with some kind of force field, sending them into retreat. Now safe, the Jedi reveals to Nomi that the creature is actually the great Jedi Master Thrawn, and he is the one who will teach Nomi and her daughter in the ways of the Force. Moving on to issue 4, we see that Nomi has spent several months on the planet of Ambria, although strangely, Master Thrawn has mostly ignored her. One morning, her daughter wanders to a lake full of dark side creatures, but Nomi, using a Force power similar to battle meditation, causes the creatures to turn on each other, saving her daughter. Osweiler reveals that he will soon be leaving in order to fight alongside Master Arca in a battle against the dark side brewing on the other side of the galaxy. Jedi Master Thrawn finally begins Nomi's training and tells her to use one of her husband's Adegan crystals to build her own lightsaber. However, Nomi refuses, as using a lightsaber would only remind her of her husband's tragic death. Elsewhere in the greater Stennis system, a mining ship comes under attack from pirates, but the pirates are defeated when the owner of the ship, Baga the Hutt, sends his warriors to defend it. Baga's enforcers bring the pirates and their leader, named Finhead Stonebone, to Boga's private room. The Hutt tells Stonebone that if he wants to live after he attacked his ship, then he must track down and kill Jedi Master Thrawn. It is here that we find out that Boga is the one in charge of the gangsters that killed Nomi Sunrider. In issue 5, Master Thrawn continues to teach Nomi about the Force, including that lightsabers are not only weapons, but tools for meditation. As Thrawn uses a holocron to lecture Nomi on the history and dangers of the dark side, Nomi's thoughts begin to dwell on her past, and she begins thinking about starting a new life away from the Jedi. However, Thrawn can feel her thoughts and tells her she can either move forward or face darkness. Even as Boga the Hutt's marauders land on the planet to attack them, Nomi refuses to use Thrawn's lightsaber or her force powers to defend herself. However, as Thrawn becomes captured by pirates, Nomi becomes sad as she realizes that another Jedi is about to fall right in front of her, just like her husband. Realizing now that she can use the same power she used to save her daughter at the lake, she uses the Force to manipulate the emotions of the Hutt's gangsters, causing them to turn on each other. She finally decides that it's time to use Thrawn's lightsaber and is able to drive off the enemies. With the gangsters defeated, Nomi and Thrawn recover, and Nomi is convinced that Thrawn did something to help her in the battle, but Thrawn tells her that she was able to defeat them with only her own courage. Realizing that the future may not be easy, Nomi now feels much more ready to face the future that lies ahead of her. So overall, I thought these comics were really good. I really enjoyed them, but I have to say, I really enjoyed the arc with Ulic and the Beast Wars way more than I did the arc about Nomi Sunrider. It's just the whole story of Onderon being at the height of this ancient war and watching these young, inexperienced Jedi have to navigate this conflict and figure out what to do is a really compelling story when they have to do it without a master. It kind of feels like a story that might come out of the High Republic or maybe the Clone Wars. In fact, Onderon actually does show up in the Clone Wars and goes through a somewhat similar conflict where Ahsoka has to help the people of Onderon overthrow a tyrannical ruler. One of my favorite things about Star Wars is always when some planet that you know better from a movie or a show actually originated in some book or comic from the 90s that you'd never heard of until you actually read it. So I really enjoyed the dynamic between Ulic and his brother. I always think it's interesting whenever they bring in siblings to be a part of the Jedi Order, even though Jedi really aren't supposed to have any close ties with their family. I just thought that Ulick's little Jedi group had a really interesting dynamic. I also really like the dynamic between Ulick and his master. Ulick really, really looks up to his master and wants to do right by him, even though he kind of lets him down at a lot of steps in the way, but you can tell that his master really cares for him. It feels like they really go a long way to create interesting dynamics between these characters that pull you in with not a lot of time on the page. I'm also really happy that Gallia, the princess of Onderon, wasn't just like a love interest for one of the characters like I kind of expected she might be from her introduction. She has some real agency in this story in the future of her people, and I am just really happy with where her character went. This story is overall just a fantastic setup for Ulick and the characters around him. There's still a lot of great stuff going on, but I can tell that there's going to be some very explosive emotions down the road, since we're already getting foreshadowed that Ulick is about to turn to the dark side, maybe. It's just really cool with these Tales of the Jedi comics, knowing that you're watching important and dramatic historical events kind of squished into these 5 or so issue long story arcs. I feel like I'm almost dreading the point in this series where it's just going to be episode upon episode of books and comics about just Han, Luke, and Leia. I love these short but still very important, sweeping, self-contained stories that tell a very important story just in a short period of time. So I just wanted to mention that these Tales of the Jedi series, after the original Marvel comics, Dark Empire, and some like newspaper strips that not a lot of people have read, are among the very first like original Star Wars comic stories to come out. Keep in mind that this Tales of the Jedi arc that we're reading, which is the first to be published before the first 2 that we've already reviewed, these came out in 1993, which is right around the time that the original Heir to the Empire trilogy was coming out. So a lot of the Star Wars stories that we had before just were retellings of the movies or took place kind of in between the movies, and we are just now getting books and comics that take place right after Return of the Jedi. So for these to come out in 1993 and to take place thousands of years before the movies is really crazy when you think about it. It's kind of a revolutionary for Star Wars at this point. Reading them now after the Dawn of the Jedi comics, which released in 2013, and especially after having seen the prequels and having those in my mind for several years, it's crazy to think about all the new ideas that Tales of the Jedi introduced way before even The Phantom Menace came out. These stories are giving us our real first look of what the Jedi Order really looked like and how it functioned, even after the Great Hyperspace War arcs, which kind of just had the Jedi as background characters. This is we get to see the Jedi kind of as they are supposed to function. I'm just impressed at how much synergy there is between how the Jedi are portrayed here as an organization and how they show up in what George had in mind for the prequels later down the line. I don't know how much direct supervision George Lucas had over this story. I don't think he meddled too much in some of these early comics as far as I know, but it just feels like that the writers really had a lot of foresight for what Star Wars might be, or maybe these comics were just really influential in how the Jedi were portrayed. It just really feels like that the writers know what they're talking about, at least in terms of like emotional arcs and the world building. Ulick's personality is really reminiscent of like a young Luke's and even a Clone Wars era Anakin. Kind of ambitious, but also a little arrogant and excited, a little too excited. And since Ulick's temptation towards the dark side is already being foreshadowed, I wonder how this journey will ultimately compare to someone like Anakin's, especially since from both a real world and a chronological perspective, we haven't seen Anakin's story be told yet. So as for the Nomi Sunrider arc, I feel like the best parts of that story is Nomi herself. And I didn't quite enjoy too many of the other characters or world-building elements from issues 3 to 5. Ander Sunrider is just kind of a weenie. Like, he gets killed because someone snuck up behind him and nicked him with a poisonous animal. I know he had to be killed off early for the purposes of the plot, but he's kind of a pathetic character. I feel like any other Jedi would have been able to sense that coming a mile away. You know, I'm not someone who gets all focused on power levels and which Jedi would beat who and all of that, but it just feels like Ander is like the weakest Jedi ever, at least in terms of like foresight. So I enjoyed Nomi's character a lot because I thought her journey of being very afraid to be a Jedi, because that carries with it kind of memories of violence, was an interesting combination that we haven't seen yet before in Star Wars. It wasn't immediately clear, though, what made her decide to ultimately pick up the lightsaber in that final battle, though, and it just took her so long to get there. I feel like they dragged it out a little too long. Like I just said, that the Beast Wars of Onderon show a lot. I don't know, kind of the whole writing for this Nomi Sunrider part just felt a little bit off to me. There's also the central conflict of the Hutts and the pirates, and this is just a very personal preference, but I've always thought that just like the Hutts and the gangsters and the random alien thugs are kind of the least interesting antagonists you can have in Star Wars. I think I much prefer villains like the Sith, whose plans are kind of grand and theatrical and dramatic and involve some kind of arcane knowledge and have like these backstories and these abilities that are, I don't know, they're just more interesting to me. Usually other Star Wars villains outside of the thugs and the smugglers and whatever have more interesting motivations other than just greed. Personally, I really loved Master Thrawn. I really love the idea that a great Jedi doesn't have to match what you initially might think of as a great warrior. It's kind of like Master Uru from the Great Hyperspace War, who's just like a jellyfish in a jar. And of course, the theme goes all the way back to Yoda in The Empire Strikes Back. One thing I do have to say about Thrawn is that I got really frustrated with the way that he was trying to teach Nomi. Like, he and everyone else is telling her that she's determined to be a great Jedi, it's her destiny, but she just doesn't want to. The idea that of being a Jedi really frustrates and upsets her, and it just feels like everyone else doesn't care about that and is just pushing her to do what they think is best for her. But I've always gotten the impression that the people who become Jedi, as adults at least, are always given the choice to take this path, even if everyone thinks it's their destiny or whatever. Here it just feels like Nomi eventually caved into what everyone else wanted. In most other Star Wars media, especially the High Republic, being a Jedi is framed as something that you need to dedicate yourself to and better yourself at every day, and it's something that you could leave at any point that you want to, and it's something that you always have a say in, and I feel like the story just violates that idea and it doesn't really feel right. So yeah, I think at the end of the day, Nomi's motivation is that she doesn't want the same thing that happened to her husband to happen to other people. If she has this power, she can use it to prevent the kind of trauma that happened to herself, and I think that's a really good angle to have for a Star Wars Jedi character. Again, a lot of this is set up for other Tales of the Jedi arcs that are going to come later, and so I'm very interested to see what Nomi does with these feelings and this motivation going forward. One thing that I've come to notice as like kind of an aesthetic and narrative choice in these earlier Star Wars comics is that there are blocks of text that will describe the action as it happens, as if there was an on-screen narrator if this was a show or a movie. And it's so fun, it's so charming, and I very quickly realized that this is something that's used far more sparingly in modern comics. These days, this kind of dramatic narration of things that is happening right in front of you might feel kind of silly and unnecessary, but I found it charming in like a kitschy, over-the-top way, and sometimes it was actually really valuable for like a deeper appreciation of the unfolding story and themes. For example, there's this one scene in the comic where at the big battle of Isis, there's these two ground soldiers that are fighting to the death, and Arca's battle meditation comes into play, and there's this really thorough and amazing description of how the will to fight and the belief in victory is really key to winning a fight. And it was just a really wonderful description of what I don't think could have been accomplished with just dialogue and imagery. And then there's places where it just feels super unnecessary, like when Keldroma gets his arm chopped off. Although I really enjoy the fluid, like straightforward storytelling of modern Star Wars comics, there's just something about these older ones that are presented that it's just so fun, and I feel like part of that is missing nowadays. And I think that the narrative technique of this like narration helps move the story along and pack in so much in only a few issues. Like, think about how much story ground was covered in just the 2 Beast War issues. Like, that much would probably have to fit in a 5-issue miniseries in a modern Star Wars like paperback. As far as the art in these comics, it's pretty similar to the last couple Tales of the Jedi series we've covered. It's the same illustrator. Definitely feels very 90s and has a similar kind of medieval fantasy aesthetic that is really cool for this ancient era of Star Wars. Far more interesting and unique than like the Dawn of the Jedi era, which basically just all looked the same as modern Star Wars, more or less. I particularly love the way that lightsabers appear in this series. They kind of have like this bulge in the bottom. It feels very fantasy, and I really enjoy it when different mediums take different stylized interpretations on exactly how certain things in Star Wars look. I feel like modern Star Wars comics and modern Star Wars media in general, other than the Visions series, I don't feel like they take enough liberties with these kind of iconic world building elements and how they can be portrayed in different ways. I feel like you can easily identify a lightsaber by a certain amount of like visual cues, and then you can push that design to make it more stylized and just interesting, and I love what they're doing with it in Tales of the Jedi. Although there definitely are some kind of bizarre artistic choices here to me. For example, I have no idea why Nomi's hair looks like super patchy and unhealthy looking, and then like it comes back in when she spends time on Ambria. Like, this isn't even like a thing of the limitations of the simple comic illustrations. Like, it's in the covers too. I don't know why that is.
Bruv, like, you fucked it up. Like, you fucked up my hairline.
And also, this guy is wearing like this harness thing. I don't know. Yeah, this era of Star Wars definitely has its visual quirks, and this is at a time where the Star Wars franchise, especially outside of the original trilogy era, is really trying to come into its own and sort of solidify its own visual identity beyond what is just in the movies. And I don't know, I think that's part of the charm. I think half of being a Star Wars fan is learning to appreciate the really weird stuff alongside the stuff that you know is just really good. I also wanted to note that for this arc and the next few arc of the Tales of the Jedi series, these stories were also actually adapted into audio drama format with fully voiced characters, sound effects, and even soundtracks from the movies. I can't really recommend listening to these as an alternative to the comic. The quality is very good, but the voice acting can sometimes be a little dramatic and over the top.
Escape thy... Hey! Your arm! My arm! They've cut off my arm!
However, if you just really like Tales of the Jedi and want more of it, or you can't easily access the comics that I'm talking about right now, I will link in the description some resources where there's one channel called the Star Wars Vintage Collection, which has the full unabridged audio drama for you to listen to that will cover this Tales of the Jedi comic arc and all of the future ones that I'll be covering, as well as a channel called Mr. Poke, which has the parts of the audio drama chopped up into each of the individual arcs, as well as showing visuals from the comics, so it's a little easier to kind of read and follow the story. And so if you want to experience some of the stories that I'm going to be talking about in the next few episodes, I'd really recommend those if you can't read the comics yourself. Well, that's about all I have to say for part 14. Next time we are going to be finishing up this story with 2 issues that make up an arc called the Freedon Nad Uprising. So I will see you guys in the next one, and may the Force be with you always.